In this week's episode of Disrupting Innovation, I'm going to be speaking with Hannah Davis and Lisa McCorkle from the Patient-Led Research Collaborative. And I'm so excited for people to listen to this one because this is another area of health technology innovation that really makes stuff happen, patient-led work. So these individuals who are incredible were not in the healthcare space before the COVID-19 pandemic. And since unfortunately going on to develop long COVID as a result of their COVID infections, these two individuals have been at the forefront of advocacy for long COVID and driving a lot of the discovery and research that needs to occur to help the 6% of the US population and tens of millions of folks around the world who are living with long COVID every single day.
This is Disrupting Innovation with Dr. David Petrino.
Hannah, Lisa, welcome to the Disrupting Innovation podcast. It's such a pleasure to have you. This is a podcast where we talk about why health innovation and change in healthcare takes so long. And so the whole point is that I want to reach out to people who touch healthcare in different ways and who have done things that didn't take long and get a sense of how they did what they did. So we usually just start off by, it would be great if you could just tell us a little bit about yourselves, how you two came to meet and how you formed, the connection that you formed and the organization that you now both are working for.
I'm Hannah Davis. I'm the co-founder of the Patient-Led Research Collaborative, which is our organization. Before I got sick, I was working in machine learning and artificial intelligence. I was doing a lot of generative art and music, and also tools for identifying bias in machine learning data sets. And then I got sick in March 2020. I'll pass it to Lisa.
And I'm Lisa McCorkle, another one of the co-founders of Patient-Led Research Collaborative. Got sick in March of 2020 as well with COVID and developed long COVID. And yeah, we can explain a little bit more what our group does. But my background is in public policy. When I got sick, I was finishing my graduate degree in public policy. Briefly worked for the government, working on SNAP policy, which is food stamps. And prior to that, I'd been working on some employment law policy and a variety of other types of policy areas. So that's really my background. And yeah, how we came together. So we both got sick March 2020, and we basically joined the Body Politic COVID-19 support group right when it was announced that Fiona Lowenstein created it, and they published an op-ed in the New York Times describing that COVID recoveries are not as simple as they're kind of being made out to be for many people. And so we both joined the support group, as did several others of our co-founding team. And it was very clear right from the beginning that people in the support group were just sharing so many of their experiences, their symptoms that were not being covered in the media. They were not being talked about by government. And there was such a wealth of information being shared, and seemingly no one else was trying to do anything with it. Many of our doctors were already gaslighting us or just saying wait, you'll recover. But meanwhile, we're having these wild symptoms that, people we haven't seen before and experienced. And so a survey was put out that some of us worked on. Our co-founder Gina was really the head of that, putting the survey together. And that really looked at, kind of what the symptoms people had been talking about, and a little bit about the experience so far. And this was just, a couple months into really people experiencing these symptoms. A few of us who were part of the Data Nerds channel, who love data, have some background in data, offered to help with the analysis and write-up of that. And that was posted in May of 2020, just as a Google Doc, and is now really the first research on long COVID. It identified neurological symptoms that previously had not been talked about. It looked at over 62 symptoms. Previously COVID was really thought of as just a respiratory illness, and it was very clear from our study and our own experience that was not the case. So from there, there was kind of a main group of us who felt very passionate, I think, about this and wanted to keep the work going. It was clear, we weren't recovering and felt like more was needed to be done. So we put out a second survey in the fall of 2020 that resulted in a paper that was published in the Lancet Clinical Medicine. And that was that documented over 200 symptoms of long COVID. And we really expanded based on what we were hearing from the community and looking at long COVID over 7 months. So my interactions with Hannah, at the beginning, were just I don't know, it was very bizarre because it was just over Slack and doing analysis and but all of us clicked very well and had very similar values. And it just, I don't know how it worked so well. We're across the country, across the world in many cases. And it's just been this really beautiful partnership that has come out of this. And now we've built an organization with our other teammates on this. And now I have really amazing friends, and they've been my major support through the last 3 years.
Incredible. Hannah, anything you want to add to that story?
I just agree that it's magical, and I think we've talked a lot about how to replicate this model, and there's components of it that I think are hard, including just how well we get along. But I think we really trust and respect each other. I think from going through something so difficult. But also, I think that the fact, at least for me, the fact that kind of I lost all this brain capacity at the same time I was starting this collaboration, made what it was part of it. I just really felt like I needed to rely on other people and rely on other people's decisions and judgment and decision making.
Gotcha. And I think we can dig into some of those things a little a little bit later on, but I want to have a bit of a fanboy moment and just say that what you've been doing has been disruptive. The paper that you spoke about in Lancet is something that I routinely put on my presentations because to date, it's still one of the most comprehensive things out there in terms of describing what people with long COVID go through in terms of diversity of symptoms and how serious those symptoms can be. And what is striking to me is that, you both explained your background. Maybe, Lisa, you're kind of healthcare adjacent in some of the policy work that you're doing, but you're not healthcare workers. You're not healthcare researchers. You're sick. And yet you're producing work that is some of the best in the world. You're getting seats at tables that typically people in healthcare who call themselves healthcare researchers need to wait, to have a prestigious career of 30 or 40 years to sit down with the CDC or the NIH or the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. So people are obviously responding to the work that you're doing. My first question is, so you've accelerated a process, right? What do you think it is about this group that is making such a difference so quickly?
I think because we are all not motivated by our careers, and kind of the things that go along with that, like ego, etc. And we were motivated by, getting better and understanding what was happening to our bodies. It's just a completely different kind of frame through which to work. So it was faster, obviously, because we knew what was happening way ahead of anything in the public. And that's been kind of a consistent theme, that we see things happening. We're, like, support groups are always kind of the canary in the coal mine. We knew reinfections caused long COVID. We knew breakthrough infections caused long COVID. We knew the neurological and cardiovascular symptoms were among the highest, most common symptoms really early on. I think that definitely was a big part of it. But then I think also, like, after we put out our first paper, it was gray literature, right? It was a Google Doc. It wasn't a formal paper. And some of the feedback we got was like, oh, I'd love to use this in this presentation at the CDC or NIH or whatever, but like it needs to be formal and citable. So I think kind of operating through a lens where we'd get the data out there the most in the way that was taken seriously was part of our motivation and success too.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, our team is fairly large and has just like such a wide variety of backgrounds. And so we have a lot of people who have been in academia, just like not necessarily in biomedical research, but we do have a lot of folks in that as well. But just like a lot of different backgrounds that we have. And so we had people who had the experience publishing and, knew how to go through that process. Because the first time I had to do an IRB, I was like, it took me a very long time. And so if we had to do that, like if I had to do that on my own at the beginning of this, I don't think it would have gotten done. But we had people who had done that process before. It was, they had teams that could help with that. So I think the background of the team was helpful in facilitating that, while like the rest of us kind of learned the space. And then I'd also say, I think so we had that background, but we also had a lot of other backgrounds that came into play. So like my background in policy, Gina and Hannah Way's background in participatory research, like all of that was really helpful in creating what we did, which was really high quality work that then was able to translate to policy. So that was one of like my priorities, was that, and really a priority of Patient-Led Research Collaborative is like, we're not just going to have this data sit there. We're going to do something with it. We're going to make sure it's understandable to policymakers. We're going to share it with policymakers. Like this is our lives at stake. So we're not just creating data to create data. Like we're going to do something with it, which I think is also a flip on what a lot of academia does, is that, a lot of people just like get the paper out there, but they publish. It's, a huge thing. Congratulations. It's awesome. It's a lot of work to do that, but then don't take that extra step to really create action. And so I think that was another step that we were very intentional about doing.
Yeah. I think I hope that, some of the people listening to this will be academics, this particular episode. And I hope that academics start to hear some of what you're saying, some of the themes that are already coming through, the theme of team science, as opposed to you've got some principal investigator that's looking to push their career forward. They've got a whole bunch of people working under them who know that they need to work hard and produce whatever the PI is telling them to work hard and produce, so that maybe they get a shot at their own career, versus a group of people coming together with a shared goal, trying to solve a problem, throwing ego out the window and saying it's too important not to solve this problem, so off we go. I think that is crucial. I also, I love what you shared about, taking action after a paper. That was one of the things that I learned pretty early on when I moved from, clinical work to basic science research, and then I moved back into clinical research. And, basic science research, you publish a paper saying, a neuron does this, or, it's interesting to you, but like most of the world doesn't really care about it. when you move into clinical research, you'll publish a paper saying, hey, I did this new stroke intervention, and there'll be a press release about it. And then what a lot of people don't really tell you is you then get 200 emails of desperate stroke survivors saying, I read about this, can I access this treatment? And in almost every researcher's career experience, you say, oh, actually, it was just an experiment. The experiment's over. No. And for my first year doing clinical research, that drove me completely bananas. I was like, my God, like, are we really just going to tell these people go away? As opposed to, okay, well, yeah, you actually can access this, and let's make this available or accessible, or, let's talk about what the next steps will be. Now, I feel as though with PLRC, again, some of the work that you're publishing is the most influential out there in long COVID. How do you wrestle with the next steps? Sometimes a lot of what you publish, there isn't immediate next step action that you can take as a non-clinical organization. So what are you trying to do? How are you, how are you, regulating that, I suppose?
I think a lot of what we did, especially right after the second paper was, or actually even the first paper came out, was just present it to people who were making guidelines. I mean, the CDC guidelines were some of the earliest stuff we worked on. The early WHO long COVID group. We started working with AAPM&R. So many medical providers, medical universities, research universities reaching out to us just to get kind of an understanding of the space, which I think did impact clinical practice too. Lisa, what would you say?
Yeah, I think that's another kind of unique aspect to this, is that I think because there was not a lot known about long COVID, and that, physicians and researchers aren't taught about other infection onset chronic illnesses, like researchers who did want to get in the space, or policymakers who were interested in it, were like, we don't know what to do. And so reached out to us because we were the only ones like talking about it that they could see. And so we did get a lot of opportunities that I think were crucial in us continuing the conversation and making sure that we were heard to the extent that we could. I'd say yeah, we helped with the guidelines, but I feel like I need to give the disclaimer now that as a patient representative, or there's only so much power you have. But I think we got really lucky in the opportunities that were presented to us. But then also just continuing to talk about it. Like Hannah has a big following on Twitter and is really good with science communication, and is able to get a lot of information out there and just keep pushing that narrative. And we really just tried to jump at every opportunity we could, and we continue to do that, which is exhausting for a group of sick people. But we kind of are we're given this opportunity, we have to take it for ourselves and for on behalf of the community, because otherwise someone else could take that opportunity that's going to share some really harmful advice. And then also partnering with other existing organizations in the space who have worked in infection associated chronic illnesses, who understand, and kind of partnering with them to learn insights and to hopefully help spread out. Because really this is the way that we've tried to approach it, is from a disability justice lens, centering sustainability, trying to center slowness, really prioritizing our health above all, which is a really difficult daily struggle for all of us, but is something that we felt like we need to do, because this isn't going to be solved overnight. And yeah, we just, we're going to do our best, and that's all we can really do. But it seems to have, I think just like the way that it's worked out, even the fact that like with COVID, so many things went virtual, and then we're also sick and can't necessarily like all travel. That overlap worked in our favor, because more rooms were open to us because it was now more virtual, right? Like if it was not, if this was like 10 years ago and all of us got sick and things didn't go virtual, we wouldn't have been able to be in the rooms that we've been able to get into.
Yeah, that's such an important piece, I think. I was actually just having a conversation this morning about a group of folks with spinal cord injury that I work with, and I was asked, how did the pandemic make their cohesion and their work more difficult because everyone was isolated and indoors? And I was like, actually the opposite. They were like, they had this rare moment of empathy where everyone, they were able to say to everyone, this is what out, how you're complaining about not being able to get out of the house and not being able to get on a plane and, all of these things you're currently complaining about. This is our lives 24/7. So, can you find it in yourself to understand, what this means? And I think it was a moment of learning for some. I think unfortunately now everyone has kind of gone a little wild with people just declaring that things are over. And but I think we need to keep reminding people that of that shared experience we all had a little while ago, because it's important. It was for a minute, everyone was sort of centering this conversation of loneliness and, the effects of loneliness and the effects of universal design and how, we can make better worlds. So it'd be nice to get back to that conversation. I don't want everyone, sheltering in place, but that conversation was important for sure. So you said another thing that was really important and something I wanted to discuss with you both. You've limited energy. You get invited to a lot of rooms now. If it's anything like my experience, sometimes the rooms you get invited into, you get told, "Thank you so much for being here. Wow, what an impressive, perspective you brought to us. We've learned so much." And then the policy gets put out and it's like the exact opposite of what you're advocating for and the exact opposite of some of the feedback that you provided. Do you have any tips or experiences of like how to spot red flags of people who are not your allies? So how do you identify folks who might be looking to sort of pop your name on something and say, see, we spoke with the community, but not necessarily acting in good faith? Or can you not know until, it comes out?
I think a lot of the time you can't know, but there are some consistencies in the beginning. I found that like sometimes people, when they're emailing, they'll be bad with boundaries, or they won't respect like the limits we've put out on spoons. Or we'll ask them to talk slow and they won't. That kind of thing is like a pretty obvious red flag, but that's more of like a one-off. I think it's almost more the opposite, where like people have to show us over and over again over time that they are allies, and just show that they, like, for me a big thing is that they know anything about the history of viral onset illnesses, or have been in that space or something like that. Just it's such a huge relief to like get on an introductory call, and like we had one this week, and just they know everything, and like you don't have to say anything new. I think that's always a good sign. But definitely for some of these other, I think we do a couple types of engagement. We do, kind of collaboration. So like N3C is one of our big ones, where we've been working with them for a couple of years on like EHR data and long COVID. And then, there's kind of the one-offs where you just give feedback on like a survey design or something, and then you're really just working in a Google Doc, and then they may or may not accept those changes. But I think where it's tricky is where you are working with a group that has so much power and is terrible at patient engagement. Like those are the hardest situations to be in, because you feel obligated to be there, but the cost is so high. It's just so high. It's psychologically so high. It's energy wise so high. And yeah, I mean, some red flags are, talking over patients, making them explain something 5 times, and particularly not having any background to the stuff. So where patients need to come in and teach you the whole field of viral onset illness. I had a call, introductory call, where someone yelled at me for using PEM. They said, "Stop using PEM. I don't know what PEM is." And it's like, okay, well then like learn it. Like let me tell it to you, and like let's continue to use it in this conversation. I don't know. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just ranting now.
No, it's so valuable to hear these things. It's almost like, I mean, it's almost like when you're building a task force for these sorts of things, especially at a government level, there should be a test, right? It's like you aren't even allowed in this room with a patient unless you know these things.
Oh my
Just
God,
like
really?
just like you would with a physician or any clinician. It's like, no, you don't get to just like walk in, haven't read the textbook, and you're going to start prescribing medicines and treating people. I say that with full knowledge that that's currently what's happening to most people with long COVID, unfortunately. But when it comes to policy making, the idea that someone doesn't know what post-exertional malaise is and is mad that you're using a term that they don't understand, that level of like that beautiful combination of fragility and ignorance is that shouldn't be allowed when it comes to engaging in policy. Like
Truly.
how can you make policy if you have that such a low barrier of such a low level of basic information about the topic? I'm a bit speechless at that, actually.
Well, I think that was even a researcher.
That was a researcher for a cognitive dysfunction project. So it gets
Like
worse.
even
It gets
worse,
worse.
honestly.
I love our little cats.
But I will. So one of the things I think is interesting. So in addition to doing like the research and the patient engagement ourselves, and trying to push forward the field of long COVID and associated conditions research from a patient perspective, we've also tried to just like push the field of patient-led research forward. And part of that is that we created scorecards that help evaluate meaningful engagement of patients in research. And I think these could be like a little bit of, not necessarily the checklist of like what like topic area expertise in long COVID, but should be a checklist for like, are you engaging patients in a meaningful way and not in a tokenizing way? And so those are some of the things that we do look for in a partnership with researchers, is like, are they meeting this criteria? How are they treating us? Are they compensating us? Are they, do we have agreements for disagreements? Like if there is a disagreement, how is that resolved? And so I think those are really valuable. And I'd say, I think they're even translatable to policy and being in the room with policymakers. I will say, so I think policy generally is, I think, a little bit further along in the field of community engagement than traditional medicine and like biomedical research. At least the way that like I was taught policy, and that's kind of seen as like the best model, right? Is like community engaged. You are constantly interacting with the community. You have town halls. You partner with community to develop policy. Like that's a much more common practice than what I've seen in research. And despite there being a large history of patient engagement in research, patients leading research, and I think like the disconnect maybe is that like people within biomedical research aren't necessarily taught the immense value that patient-led and patient-engaged research really has, and how to do it, right? That's just like not really taught, versus in policy that it's more taught if you like study that or are involved in that. So I do think that was an interesting disconnect, and kind of like one of the lenses that I brought was like, oh, this just like makes sense. Like it makes sense for the community who is most impacted to have a say and to be leading the research and to be suggesting solutions. Like we are the ones impacted, so we have the solutions. But that's just like not as common of a practice in research for biomedical research.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I would go a little bit further and say it's not even always just viewed as relevant, and that's a really damning thing to say. But ultimately, as the way that we're trained as researchers, especially in the United States, but also same way in Australia, is you find your question that you're going to spend your career answering, right? And so then you sort of make all of you run all of these experiments across your career to further this like narrative that you're trying to make about the condition that you're exploring, so on and so forth. And you're kind of told almost when you're writing grants as an afterthought, oh, well, just in this last sentence, throw in how it's going to be highly relevant to the stroke community or spinal cord injury or whatever. Like, but don't worry about that. Just say it's going to be impactful, but the idea is like it's your little magic sauce that you're trying to develop, and you're trying to get more money to keep developing the idea. And one of the most frightening things that I heard as an early researcher that was being trained on how to write NIH grants was, there was this guy up the front taking the class, and he was he had won the most NIH money in his field, like 10 years running. And then he quit and just went around the country teaching people to write grants because there was more money in that. And his opening line, which made me almost quit science, was never tell anyone in a grant that you're going to solve a problem, because you're being peer reviewed by people who have a vested interest in you not solving the problem. If you solve the problem, they don't have anything to study. So no matter how good your data is, no matter how good your idea is, never promise to solve a problem. Just say that the knowledge that comes from this grant will kick the can down the road. And so from a very formative stage, researchers are being told not to center a patient's voice, only to create intellectual property that, can prolong their career, but also to, not swing big, follow incremental discovery. And I mean, I would, I can personally say, like, through my lens, because I was like, fuck that, I'm not doing that. I'm just going to say that, I'm just going to get patients in a room and say, well, what do you need? And we're going to go off and do that. And interestingly, when I first pitched that idea of a lab, of just action-oriented, community co-designed research, the initial feedback that came back was like, oh, so you don't have a core competency. You're just like doing science that other people tell you to do. Like, that was like the direct feedback that came from career scientists. And I was like, that's a really radical interpretation of what I'm trying to do, is to say you don't have a core competency. That's not the first thing I would say about what I'm proposing here, but okay.
So weird.
It's so weird, but we've created this scarcity environment for researchers where you tell them it's only acceptable to have one idea. You can't get often people get criticized in their grants for, no, you're the expert in this thing, you shouldn't be doing this thing, which I also think is a reason why we're getting so many graded exercise therapy grants being presented, because it's like, these people have been writing graded exercise therapy grants for years. They don't want to hear about PEM. They don't want to hear about it because that doesn't fit their narrative. They know how to write a graded exercise therapy grant or a CBT grant. They don't, they've been trained that if they throw something radical out there, like, hey, let's study mitochondrial dysfunction and oxidative stress and try and understand what's happening to someone when they crash, they're going to be told, well, you're not the oxidative stress person, so we're not going to fund you. And it leads to very incremental, so small thinking and reductionist thinking that, again, it doesn't lead itself to team science that actually solves problems, which is what PLRC is doing. And it's really challenging.
It's terrible because there's just there are people out there who make connections across like disciplines that are obvious to them and are meaningful directions to go into research. It's just really disappointing to be limited in that way.
Yeah, I think that it just must be, I don't know. I feel like the incentive structures for so much of this field are all out of whack. But yeah, it's frustrating that I think we know that so many researchers that we work with probably went into the field wanting to make a difference and wanting to I feel like very few people I actually don't know if this is true, but I hope this is true, go into a PhD or an MD being not wanting to make change and not wanting to make a difference in the world and help people. And so it just really sucks that because of the incentive structures, because of how the field has developed, that is disincentivized and really looked down on, kind of seen as actually the way to make change is in this very narrow way and incrementally, and that's the only way. Yeah, it's just a shame, because I feel like the people who get into this field probably had bigger dreams.
No, absolutely. I think it gets beat out of them. They're told, don't be audacious, don't think big, just do the safe thing. And one of the things that, I often get asked to sort of give innovation talks about, how to do science in different ways and different models. And one of the things that I found it necessary to do is I have a privilege slide at the end. And I'm like, hey, by the way, I took a whole bunch of risks because I didn't have student debt. I'm white. I'm a dude. I'm cisgender. I read and speak English. These were all of my privileges that I came into, which actually allowed me to have incredible risk tolerance, because when I looked at some of my colleagues who felt equally trapped, and while I was saying, you know what, fuck this, I'm going to go do my thing that I think is important, they were like, well, I got $200,000 in college loans and I really need to do what my boss is telling me, because if I get fired while I'm a mid-career postdoc, I'm done. My career's over. And so they make a lot of decisions based on just how much risk they can tolerate, which is almost nothing. And very quickly, these big ideas just get squished down into little ideas that are safe, but not actually necessarily useful to the field at large, or to the patients who are, who are waiting for new breakthroughs and new therapies. And it's regrettable. I've even started to see on college intake forms for medical school and neuropsych programs and things like that, they're starting to specifically say, please, in your entry essays, please do not talk about your personal experience with mental health or physical health. we don't want people leveraging their personal experience to get a position in our college. And I'm like, you're actually trying to tell people to not bring lived experience to, what they want to do. Like, are we all supposed to just be these cold, objective robots that, don't care about what they're doing? It's wild, like I don't particularly feel that I need to have lived experience in what I'm doing. I learn from others, but I've also, in the same breath, I'm not going to say don't do this because you have lived experience. It's kind of, I don't know. I don't know if maybe I'm naive. I don't like to think that these things are sort of conspiratorial. I think it's just, I don't know, people feeling fragile and grumpy and trying to just trying to make sure that they're protecting what they think is the important part of the tradition of what they're doing. But sometimes I'm also just like, this feels like a direct attack, and this feels as though maybe there is a conspiracy going on to keep people out, although I don't know what the upside of that would be.
I feel like anything that like alienates a huge portion of your humanity is beneficial for like capitalism and structures like that, because if you don't like relate to and you've kind of alienated it and you don't find a community based on it, etc., then that power doesn't exist in conjunction with the group. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know, like that there's power, right, in identifying as chronically ill and disabled and meeting other people and getting words for your vocabulary and more understanding of what you're going through, and the more you know about it, the more you can do about it. And I don't know, maybe that's also too conspiratorial, but I don't know.
Just conspiratorial enough, I think. So the other sort of direction and question I wanted to ask is more about, we've talked about a lot of the positivity around patient-led research. So there are probably some challenges as well, I would imagine. The first thing I want to think about and talk about is, people who are not patients who are conducting research often have inherent biases that can affect their work. Do you feel also biases in the work that you do? So just off the top of my head, a symptom that you have that you kind of might just assume that everyone else is having, and so you say, hey, this is important. How do you check your biases? How do you, like, what sort of a process do you go through? And how much of a issue is it at all that you find yourself struggling with?
I think the second survey helped a lot with that, because part of, where we were living was in the Slack group where we were just seeing like anecdotes, like hundreds of anecdotes, but still anecdotes like spread across channels. And so getting kind of like rough estimates of like which symptoms were happening the most, which were happening the least, things like that, I think was helpful to start knowing what to advocate for and where to advocate. But I think we've, like, at least from my perspective, we've also we've been like reactive to public narratives, if that makes sense. So like the first one being that, COVID takes 2 weeks to recover from. So a lot, I mean, I wouldn't say it's like a bias to say that, it was longer than that, but it was like a thing that we were trying to push, that it does take longer to recover and that some people aren't recovering. The second one was that it was respiratory illness, where we knew it had all these neurological and cardiovascular impacts. One thing I see a lot of is, like providers and researchers are taught about some of these conditions. We know that COVID leads to increased risk of diabetes. We know it leads to increased risk of vascular events like strokes, and particularly heart attacks and cardiovascular events. But when we are talking with researchers, like a lot of those things were known, like at the beginning of calls or like in proposals and stuff, where conditions like ME/CFS and dysautonomia, because they weren't taught in med schools, were not known. So I think we end up advocating a lot for those conditions where like there's the need to do medical provider education in that way. But I do think, like being a good advocate requires that you're advocating for more than your own symptom subset. And a lot of the patient engagement, things we do kind of require that too, that you're able to speak to many different experiences of long COVID.
Yeah, I mean, we still are doing science, like we're still following the scientific method. Like we just identify hypotheses based off our own experience, yes, but then also what we're hearing from the community. And that's even like reflective. I feel like, maybe a good example is that like reproductive health in long COVID is super, super important to me. And that's because like one of my biggest impacts has been developing premenstrual dysphoric disorder following my COVID infection. And so I was like, I've been really interested in that and partnered up with, other folks on the PLRC team to be like, we need to write about this. And we like pitched it to you, David. And like, now we have the Frontiers article about this. But there's no evidence really anywhere about premenstrual dysphoric disorder in long COVID or even just generally. Like there's just like very little research out there. And so like I did what I could with the data that's out there, which was not much. And so like all I could do given that is say like we need more research on this because I know I'm experiencing this. I know that, many people in the community are experiencing this, but we don't have data to support that. We don't have data researching that. So, I think like, I feel like that's maybe a good example of like, it's not like my bias of like, this is what I'm experiencing took over that full article. Like it's mentioned once as like future research. But, we're like using the scientific method. We are testing hypotheses that are of interest to ourselves and the community and presenting what we have. And that's like what any scientist is going to do. And yeah, I think there is that like narrative that our biases like take over. And, we definitely have biases, but I think we do a good job. And that's like part of the team science thing of like checking each other's biases and, and there's there's a lot of checks and balances in place for that type of thing.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Like even from very early on, we had like checks and balances. And I think like we all, like we don't put something out that any like of the leads would feel uncomfortable with. And that's been true from early on, even if it did like turn out true. And yeah.
Amazing. And so then as we sort of move down the path of challenges, Hannah, yes, you are highly active on social media and you have a lot of following. And, I think social media is a scary and dark place a lot of the time. Honestly, the way I interact with social media is probably, like in the handbook of how not to, because I just like sort of go out there and say a thing that I want to say and then just like don't take any responsibility for it and just like walk away because literally I have no time. It's just like, I can't be arguing with people at all hours. But I feel that we are reaching a point in the sort of long COVID and infection associated complex chronic illness space where there are people who, there are folks who are forming divisions and they're feeling as though things are objectionable. I'm really curious to hear about. I love a lot of the ways that you share sometimes, Hannah, about not platforming certain things, and not interacting with certain things. I'd love to hear a little bit about like, what's your decision-making process for things that you're like, you know what, I am going to platform this and I'm going to call it out, versus I'm just going to let people talk some trash over here and just not pay it any mind because it's not productive?
I think that, yeah, that's a great question. I think there's like kind of two groups that have been like terrible on Twitter. Like the first, like when we put out the second paper, it was like the COVID minimizers and the long COVID minimizers, where like basically I felt like I wasn't gonna like get through to those people by trying to argue with them. I think like if they have a huge following and I think that they are a good faith actor who would change their mind, like if I put in the energy to try to give them data or like collect data and send it their way, then like I'll choose to do it. But there are so many people on Twitter who are bad faith actors and who are just, stirring up trouble. And it's hard because, Twitter's designed to kind of like naturally augment that stuff. But it does feel really important to just like mute those people and move on. I think like for the more recent stuff, like where I'll step in is, like when people are being attacked, like have been recently. And that's like more of just a communication of values like to the community. Like I think it's important for the community to like step up as a whole and say like we are not going to accept targeted attacks on advocates. Like when everyone is tired and everyone is, one tweet away from giving up advocacy forever, that is not like a risk we should be taking, and like trying to like communicate to the community that they kind of have to step up and things like that. But I would say, yeah, most of the time my approach is just to not engage because of what we now know about the Twitter algorithm, which is that, commenting on someone's thread is like one of the biggest things you can do to like boost their account. Looking at their account boost their account. Like you are giving people power. Literally, you are giving people power by giving them attention. And so I try to think of it from an algorithmic perspective and just not giving them algorithmic power.
That's good. That cools the temper as well, right? It's like if you can think like an algorithm, that really does help to put it in perspective. Lisa, do you have any pearls or any experiences?
I really hate Twitter. I don't think that's, it's not like a hot take or anything. But I just am like not good with it. It's not how like my preferred source of communication. I like have extreme anxiety over like every single character I write. So I think that's been a tough piece of being an advocate for this community that is like largely online, is that's kind of like the way that we need to communicate with our community. And I know like I can do a better job at being proactively transparent with like our work and what we do. And a lot of times that has felt like I think this is probably wrong, but like it has taken a backseat to doing the work, is being proactively transparent. Because it's just like, we only have so many hours in the day. We only have so much energy in the day. It feels like doing the work is more important. And I think the last few months have, taught me like, okay, maybe a really important piece of this, I think, is that transparency and like letting the community know so that they can like trust us, what we're doing, what we're fighting for, and so that they can also have input. But it's just like Twitter is just such an awful platform for that. And I wish there was something else that we were all on to discuss, where it was like just good faith actors. Because a lot of times it's like people assume poor intentions, like straight away, even after like we've been doing this work for 3 years and have a lot to show that like we have the best interests of the community at heart, that we are not in this for like a career or for money, or, you know, like we are just like, we're trying to find answers. And I would love if long COVID was no longer a thing. Like that's literally the dream. So anyone saying otherwise is just like completely misinformed. But yeah, I think it's just like, it's this combination of like being transparent and like proactively transparent is hard. And I also just like am constantly scared of tweeting, and need to develop thicker skin for like the you know, backlash. Yeah.
I think also people just truly don't, like, once you get to a point, people truly just don't think of you as a person, you know, like unless they know us personally from like Body Politic or a different support group, like at some point you're just like a target for like anger that is reasonable to feel at this point 3 years in, given that there's no outlets, right? There's no real like funding, there's no real urgency around the stuff. It's totally reasonable for people to feel angry. But it looks like we have power, and like truthfully, and like, you know, many of us like have signed NDAs to not be able to talk about the limited amount of power we have in some of these situations. And it's just really, really misguided. And I think people don't see like how burned out we are too, and how much this work takes from us. Like for me, as someone who's like, you know, on the moderate side of things, like it's all I do. Like it's all I do. I don't get to like go out and have a life. Like I wake up and I work for the hours I'm functional, and then that's it. And like I think any of us, you know, like we all want this to be over. Like none of us want to keep doing this. And I think they also don't realize that, you know, they risk you know, they risk us by targeting us. They risk our advocacy. They risk you know, the progress we are making, because we just we can't be under
I thank you both for sort of expressing that, because I think it's so important to hear. I think one of my biggest triggers is when someone sort of implies that, you know, I'm somehow gaining from all of this suffering, and I'm just like, no, I'm just pathologically unable to walk past this giant burning dumpster fire and not like run in and help. But in no way has my life gotten better by taking on, you know, this responsibility. And then I get like triply angry for the patient population, because I'm like, you're sitting there having to treat yourselves, you know. And we look at some of the folks like, you know, Remission Biome, and you know, who are literally organizing groups of people who are testing drugs and putting IVs in, and you know, and I'm enraged by that, because it's such a failure of the systems that we have in place to look after people. We're not looking after people, and so folks are organizing, and then unfortunately, if you gain a small amount of prominence as an organizer, you're being told, well, you can't be trusted, you're definitely corrupt, or why did you let this thing happen? And you know, there's
terrible.
so much responsibility, and it's not what any of us signed up for. We all want it to be over, and you know, I think all of us can say very, very honestly, none of us are financially gaining. You know, one of the things that I'm often sort of reminding people is like, if I see 1,000 patients in a month, or if I see 10 patients in a month, my salary does not change. You know, there is no incentive for me to be working until 8, 9, 10, 11 o'clock. But, you know, there is a responsibility, you know, that I feel to do it, because you've got this community that no one's taking responsibility for. And it is, I think that's the point where I sort of turn away from social media, when it's just like, you're seeing all of this noise and people making these assumptions, and I understand that there's a lot of folks hurting out there, and that's, I mean, even the people who aren't sick are hurting, and they don't have a frame of reference for how awful it is to have long COVID or ME/CFS or chronic Lyme. So they're just saying, you don't know how awful it is for me to feel guilty about going out. So stop making me feel guilty. It's a messy situation we find ourselves in, and I'm glad that we're all together in it.
Sam, I feel like we should take this moment to, just like thank you for jumping into this, like you did since the beginning. Like I think like you were the first, weren't you? Like just like
who knows?
just just like trusting us, trusting that this was happening. Like I think like it like literally doesn't even matter, like all the trolls, all the haters don't matter when we know that there's like people like you on our sides, and like the morale you bring to the table is just enormous. And so thank you for like putting yourself in front of those people, because it really does end up helping us so much at the end of the day, just to have you in the space.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. And I appreciate you guys so much, because you've, from the very beginning, I agree with you, having worked with many patient-led organizations across my career, across many conditions. What PLRC does is very different. It has been clear that from the outset, you're intentional about creating structure and very thoughtful process around everything that you do. It's clear that you're doing things for the right reasons and not for some nefarious, trying to push research in an agenda that suits the people who are leading. It's clear that it's team science from people who like each other. And it's really, it's really refreshing to work with the whole team, and, and hopefully get stuff done and move the needle, and show people that science can move faster than 17 years to make a breakthrough, which is our national average, if you can believe it.
Amazing. I can believe it, actually. Yeah. It feels that way.
It definitely feels that way. Well, we've been going for an hour, and I obviously appreciate the attention and the time, and what putting in an hour of a video call does. So I think we can call it here, and this is a very positive note to end it on. Thank you so much for chatting with me. Is there anything that you want to put out there for people? Any last thoughts? Any ways to, check out PLRC and help the cause?
I think we're still recruiting for the reinfection survey, right?
Yeah,
we've got go on.
We have a reinfection survey, so it's open to anyone. And that's looking at the impact of reinfections on long COVID, and if you didn't develop long COVID, and just looking at the impact of reinfections. So that's out there. You can look at our website, which is patientledresearch.com. We also just published our first issue of the Patient-Generated Hypothesis Journal, which is a journal of hypotheses developed by the patient community, patient and caregiver community. So, we found that it's often hard to get published as someone, who doesn't necessarily have the credentials or the background, just as you were kind of mentioning. If you're not an expert in that specific field, hard to get published. So we decided to create our own. So that's out there. And yeah, you can reach us at team@patientledresearch.com via email. And if you dare go on Twitter, we're at patientled.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for your time, and I can't wait to one day stop working on this with all of you once we've solved it. So
that'll be a great day.
Thank you.
This is Disrupting Innovation with Dr. David Petrino.